our family goes back to a fellow by the name of Francillo Durfee, and he is a common ancestor of over half the people in the valley, one way or another. He's, there's a lot of them that in this valley that go back to him, and so I'd like to kind of go back and start with him just a little bit. I know I'm supposed to be talking about Henry Dennison, and I'll get to that, but I'd kind of like to give you a little bit of background on Henry Dennison and how he came to be. Francillo Durfee was living in upstate New York and was married to a gal called Miriam Jones. And they converted to the church in 1840. Now, Henry Dennison was born to this couple in 1833. But in 1840, Francillo moved with his family to Nauvoo, where he became quite a prominent member of the community. He wound up with 6 children total. He had 4 boys and 2 girls, of which Henry Dennison was the second son. And Myron Bushnell, and I understand that's Clark's ancestry, partly.
So far, so good.
So far, just seeing it got this straight, Clark. And Myron was the oldest son, and Henry Dennison was the second son. They had a son by the name of Richard James, who died at the age of 7 months, and then they had another boy by the name of James Madison. They had 2 girls, one Marion Braidfoot, and a little gal by the name of Emma. Now, during the time that Henry Dennison was in Nauvoo, this was a time of quite a lot of turmoil and upheaval in the church, a lot of mob action going on, and actually Francillo was away for supplies one time, and the mobs came and stole his cattle, burned his house, and put his wife and children out in the snow. And his wife, having just given birth to little Emma a few weeks prior, got sick with the exposure and the cold, I imagine pneumonia. She died and left this little family without a mother. So anyway, Francillo, he was born, like I say, in 1833, and he was baptized a member of the church in 1844. That would have made him about 11 years old. When the Francillo and his family were moved out, they were some of the first group that started for the Salt Lake Valley. They were among the first ones that left Nauvoo and headed for Salt Lake. Of course, they didn't get there that first year. Many of them wound up in winter quarters. And then Francillo was inducted, drafted, whatever you want to call it, into the Mormon battalion. And so he left his family without a mother, we assume with relatives, at the very least some friends there at winter quarters close to Council Bluffs. His family stayed behind, and Francillo went with the Mormon battalion. So there's some interesting stories, and I don't want to get too much into Francillo because we really need to have him have his own thing. But there's a couple of interesting facts about Francillo, just to give you a background of what kind of people they were. Francillo was apparently a pretty good shot, because he was assigned the task of doing the scouting and hunting for the Mormon battalion. He and his nephew Jarvis, who was 16 years old at the time, They were the ones that went out to help find food. Now, I did a little bit of research, and I was reading along, and I found a story of where Francillo and Jarvis were out hunting for food. Grizzly bear. They came across a grizzly bear that was threatening to attack. They had one shot in their rifle. Well, I did a little research. The rifles that the Mormon battalion had were 1816. They were obsolete rifles that the government gave to the Mormon battalion. Everybody else in the military had 1835 model rifles, but the Mormon battalion had 1816 model rifles, and they were a muzzle loading muzzle rifle, smooth bore. They were not very accurate. Anyway, they when confronted with this bear, they both gave a little prayer, raised their muskets and fired. And when the bear was dressed out, they discovered that both bullets had pierced his heart. So, kind of an interesting story. They were obviously pretty decent shots. A little help maybe from above, but this was the kind of people they were. They were hardy, hardworking, patriotic people. They were good people. Okay. Now, Francillo, do I dare tell too much more about Francillo?
No, that's probably fine for now.
Francillo was one of the ones that was listed as one of the first ones to enter the Salt Lake Valley with Brigham Young. His family was not with him. His family he had left back in Council Bluffs, and they didn't come until the next year, the following year. Now, Henry Dennison and his brothers, being probably 13 to 17 years of age, undoubtedly were expected to help drive some of the wagons across the plains for other families whose husbands were either in the Mormon battalion or the widows or something. They were old enough that I'm sure that they were expected to drive these wagons across the plains, and did. Now, let's see. Yeah.
Can I just interject here?
Sure, interject.
In case you're wondering how Francillo came into the valley at the same time Brigham Young, if he was on the Mormon battalion, was because he was sent north from Pueblo, Colorado. The Mormon battalion went south into California, and about in Pueblo, Colorado, there were a group of the battalion members that were sick. And so they formed what they called the Sick Battalion and sent them north to find Brigham Young and find the Salt Lake Valley, basically. And that's how Francillo ended up with them, is that he actually found Brigham Young just as they were going into the valley. The rest of the Sick Battalion was not with him at the time, but Francillo happened to find Brigham Young as they went in, so he was with them when they went into the valley.
The good doctor, the good military doctor that they had, was treating the sick men with calomel and arsenic. And yeah, he was helping them out all he could. Huh?
Spoonful every day?
Yeah, good stuff,
Yeah.
keeping them going. And anyway, but that's how he came to come with Brigham Young, and his family was not there. They stayed behind. So anyway, Henry Dennison, they came. I've got some stuff here if I can find it. When the family got together in 1848, and Francillo moved with his family to what they called Mound Fort, which is now Ogden, and there was a number of families there that were intertwined with them. There wasn't, and one of them was John Ambrose Barker, and he married one of his daughters, I assume. So I'm gonna let Kent take over that here in just a minute, but I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the facts. Kent's going to talk a little more about what happened when he came to the valley here. But Henry Dennison was obviously a very capable individual and somebody that could be trusted to do a job, because Brigham Young called him several times to go out and rescue the handcart companies that were stranded. He was also sent across the plains numerous times, we're not exactly sure how many, with teams of oxen to bring the poor from back east out. And he traversed the country a number of times. Another little interesting thing that was part of his life, his history, was the fact that he was called by Brigham Young to be one of the Pony Express riders. Now these people that were excuse me, Pony Express riders were a little bit special. They were tough and hardy men, but they were also not very big, because they wanted to save the weight on the horses for the mail. And so these guys were tough and ready guys, but they were not big men. And that's why I'm built so close to the sidewalk, is because I have all those nice genes in my family. But anyway, don't you say a word, Clark. I know you were thinking, I could see them wheels turning. Anyway.
Kent, or Bruce?
Yes.
On that note too, I've read where a lot of them were young, like 16 and something like that. They were young, and they preferred orphans. There was a sign, an advertisement out for orphans to do the Pony Express. Yeah, well, because it was kind of a high, it was a pretty hazardous duty, and they didn't want them to have to, get in a situation and have their family lose their husband, father. So anyway, it was.
Bruce, you need to clarify about Brigham Young's, that it was different.
Oh, okay, yeah, and Jan gave me some stuff here that about the Pony Express. Apparently Brigham Young attempted to start the Pony Express. It wasn't called the Pony Express, it was called
Swift.
The Swift Pony Express. And he attempted to do that before the Pony Express ever came into existence. And he
1857.
Yes. And anyway, he got the okay to go ahead and do it, but then President Van Buren, who they say was not a really good president anyway, decide I'll get into politics, don't want that. He didn't like the Mormons. He didn't really like the Mormons. In fact, he's the one that sent Johnson's army out to take over the Utah territories and relieve Brigham Young of the governorship. He was no friend of the Mormons. Anyhow, Brigham Young had come up with this idea and to set up this Swift Pony Express, and got the okay to do it. But when it came right down to the nitty gritty, the contract was given to other people, and a couple of years later, actually, they never really got it off the ground with Brigham Young. It came to be in other ways, and then it didn't last for a long time because it almost immediately became outdated because of the telegraph and the Transcontinental Railroad that came through, and so the Pony Express was kind of short-lived. But when Brigham Young first thought of it, it was a pretty novel idea, and I'm sure that's where they came up with the idea initially, was from Brigham Young. And anyway, he only rode for the Pony Express for about 6 months, I think. But anyway.
It said that they had been riding this route and doing it, for the 6 months, and then they canceled the contract, and some of the men were actually out and had delivered the mail and were waiting to take the mail back to Salt Lake, and they wouldn't let them have it.
Yeah. They just canceled the contract. But anyway.
I wonder if he and Thomas Owen crossed paths.
Well, he would have been in a different...
Yeah.
Different deal, but...
He would have been in the other Pony Express.
Yeah.
National one.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
I don't remember, because it wasn't put together the other Pony Express, but it wasn't
Well, it's probably here somewhere.
No, that's not in that.
Not in there?
No, it's in there.
Okay. Anyway, another little tidbit of interest in Francillo was remarried and was called on a mission to Fort Lemhi. The Brigham Young sent him out in search of Indians, Lamanites to teach, and they attempted to find some. Brigham Young thought they would be stopping on the Snake River, and they didn't find the Indians. And so they just kept going and going and going, and they found out that the Indians, the Nez Perce and Shoshone-Bannock tribes, were up on Salmon River, fishing for salmon. And so they went clear to the Salmon River, which Brigham Young wasn't real thrilled about, but he was okay with it when he saw how well they were doing. And that's a whole other deal on Francillo, but they got into a pickle with the Indians. The Indians, they had two different tribes, and they were kind of at war with each other, and the missionaries were in between, and there were some fugilities over the horses. The Nez Perce had housed their horses in the fort, and the Shoshone-Bannock wanted to steal them, and they couldn't because they was in the fort. And then the Nez Perce came and took their horses, and the Shoshone-Bannock claimed that the Nez Perce had stolen their horses. And anyway, there was quite a confab, but they got to warring with each other. And then Johnson's army, here's another deal, Johnson's army come in the middle of all this thing, and they were in trouble because they'd kind of outrun their supplies, because the Mormons had kind of taken all the stuff.
Scorched earth.
Scorched earth. They were having a hard time getting any food, and they heard that this group of people up in Fort Lemhi had cattle, and they did have about 350 head of cattle. And so the Johnson's army sent out some people to talk to the mountain men, who talked to the Indians and incited them to riot so that they could steal the cattle, which the Indians did, stole the cattle to take to Johnson's army. And Francillo had about 35 head of cows, I think it said. And after the Indians got done, he wound up with one cow. And the only reason he wound up with one cow is because when the Indians took her, she had just had a small calf. And it wouldn't move with the rest of the cattle, so they left it, and the cow came back. So he wound up with a cow out of the deal. But Henry Dennison was one of the volunteers that started out to rescue this group that's at Fort Lemhi. And apparently the snow was pretty deep because they started out in February, and they talked about how they had to have double team the wagons sometimes to pull themselves through the drifts and they did finally get them. There was 3 or 4 people that were killed in this uprising, but they did rescue most of them. And as they were coming back, it was April, and they were still bucking some pretty big drifts. So they were hardy people. Henry Dennison was not necessarily sent to Fort Lemhi to rescue, but he went because his father and stepmother and some of his siblings, step-siblings and so forth, were there, and he went to help. So that's kind of a guy who was resourceful, trustworthy, tough, pioneer kind of a guy. So, and he married Jane Isobel Barker while they were living at Ogden. I'm going to turn it over to Kent, and he'll tell you how they got to the valley.
All right. I'm going to try and Bruce giving you pretty much the history of the Durfees. And I'm going to try and give you a little bit of insight into who Jane Isobel Barker was and how she got to be into the Ogden area. Jane Isobel Barker was born in 1839 in Waterton, Jefferson, New York. Her father was Frederick Barker,
and her mother was Ann Bligh Barker. Okay, they came across the ocean from England. They left England in March of 1830. The Barker family left England in 1830. They came on an old warship which was called the New Brunswick. It took them a month, 30 days to cross the ocean. During the crossing, Frederick had a brother named George, and George and Frederick's both families were coming. In the crossing, George's wife contracted smallpox, and she passed away, which left George with a small family. Well, they got to America, and they were found by some missionaries, Benjamin Brown and Jesse Crosby, and they taught them the gospel. I'm not sure exactly when they were converted, but that by says my sisters Sarah and Harriet were baptized in 1844 by Benjamin Brown, and the whole family joined the church except for one sister, and she married a guy, and they moved to Wisconsin. The family left New York, Watertown, New York, and headed for Nauvoo in 1846. So if you think about that, that's really after the saints were gone from Nauvoo. So, and they arrived in Nauvoo, and it was pretty much cleaned out. And about the only thing they did when they got to Nauvoo was they made a trip to the top of the temple, because the temple had been abandoned. And Jane Isobel, she says she didn't go in. I don't know if she was too young or what, but she said
She was scared of heights.
I guess she was scared of heights. Anyway, says she sat on the step and bawled just as loud as she could. Anyway, so that didn't. That's all they had in Nauvoo, and then they went across the river and went to Mount Pisgah, where they spent the summer. Eventually, they ended up in a place called Indian Prairie in Iowa, and then eventually they moved to Council Bluffs. She says she was only 10 years old when she crossed the plains, and most of the older folks walked most of the way across the plains. They would milk the cow in the morning, strain the milk into a butter churn, strap it into the wagon, and then as the wagon moved through the day, the milk would churn into butter balls. That's how they churned their butter. So, anyway. They arrived in Salt Lake on October 20th, in 1849, and their captain, Captain Brown, was taken with Weber country, the Ogden area, and he talked them into going there to settle. And so they moved there into some empty cabins that were just a few rods from the junction of the Ogden and Weber rivers. Says with us at this time were the families of David Moore, George Barker, Frederick Barker, Amos Andrews, Francillo Durfee, and an old mountaineer named Mr. Button. All right, at this point I would like to kind of give you an idea of who Jane Isobel Barker's family were and what kind of people they were. And I've got a couple of stories that really touch me. This is a story that's told by Alice Jane Durfee. Anybody ever remain Aunt Alice Rice? This is her telling her mother's story. And she says, when we first came into Utah Valley in 1849, we had very little flour, and so we were living on cornmeal and ground wheat. The men planted all of our spare grain, I assume the next year, to be able to raise wheat for bread the following year. And that was when the crickets came. And apparently there was more than just one time that the crickets came. But in this particular day, it says one day the children came running in and said, "Mother, come look. There's a big cloud going right toward our grain patch." It was the crickets. Mother tried to get the men folks to go and help scare them away, but Father was afraid they would only light on the neighbors' fields and then come back to ours. Mother said they could go and scare them too, but Father was discouraged and wouldn't go. Mother said, "Come on, girls, Harriet and Jane, and let's go." So they took sheets and tin pans and to drum on, and they went forth and back through the grain, but the crickets didn't move. This is where it gets a little touching to me. It says, "Then we saw Mother. She was standing still, and she was praying. So we stood still. She was praying aloud in tongues. And as she prayed, the crickets began to rise until the sky was black with them. They all left, flew down to the lake, and never came back. We raised 600 bushels of grain that year." Okay, another story. The Ute and Bannock Indians were kind of having difficulties. And this, just to set it up, an old Bannock Indian with his squaw and a little sister were out hunting. They managed to bag a deer, but by the time they got the deer taken care of, it was late, and so they decided to camp. So they camped, and during the night, a young Ute Indian came and saw their fire, and he came into their camp and told them that he was hungry and tired and asked if they could feed him, and they did. And then they bedded down for the night. Well, during the night, this Ute Indian killed the man, told the squaw to go back to her people, and then he took the little girl. Okay, so this is how the little girl ended up with the Bannock girl ended up with the Ute Indians, okay? Well, this Ute Indian brought, and I don't know if it was the same guy or if it was after he'd taken her back and whatever, but anyway, they came into Ogden to beg for food. He brought this little girl to Mound Fort to beg, and they came to Mother's place first. Said the little girl was bruised and bleeding from cuts that the guy had made on her with the back of his knife, and he'd been dragging her through the snow, and she was covered with snow and mud. Anyway, he brought her to Mother and told him he wanted to leave the little girl there while he went around to beg. Well, he left her, and while she was there, she found out that the little girl thought that he was going to kill her. And so the little girl hid in the house. Well, she hid in under some clothing that was piled up. And when the Indian came back and demanded the girl, they wouldn't give her to him, and so he went through the house poking. He actually even poked holes in the floor, trying to find this little girl, and he poked the clothes, but the little girl didn't say anything. and they didn't find her. Well, he finally gave up and left, but then, let's see, when was it? After he left, they took her, the little girl, and hid her in a straw stack. And she was in that straw stack for 3 weeks. They would take food and water out to her and kept her hidden. Well, the Indians kind of were watching because they were trying to find this little girl, and they got wise to where she was hid. And so they circled the haystack and declared that they were going to burn the haystack. Well, so then they had to bring the little girl in, and they brought her in, and there was a little soldier at this time, brought her to the house. He says, my Uncle George was there, and he jumped up when the little soldier pointed his gun at the little girl and acted like he's going to shoot her. And Uncle George jumped up and said, look here, what are you going to do? And the Indian said, me heap mad. And Uncle George said, me heap mad too. And threw his cane at the Indian and hit him. And he chased him clear off the place, running and throwing his cane. And Uncle George, from then on, was known as Tookie Here by the Indians. Because every time he'd talk to him, he said, now looky here. Shake his finger out, and now looky here. Anyway, well, this was the first run-in they had. But they came back about a month later. Well, let's see. Kept her about a month. One day she went, Ann Bligh went to the neighbors to borrow some yeast, and while she was coming back, little soldier tried to run her over with his horse. Well, she was near a haystack and managed to get in under it and to protect herself. But the next day, the whole tribe came and surrounded the house and threatened to kill the whole family if they didn't give up this little girl. And so they decided they had to let her go. Well, they took her, and as they started to leave the yard, it says my sister Harriet and Louisa, who became a Bronson, ran right out amongst the Indians, grabbed the little girl's hand, and brought her back to the house. The Indian left her there and said, heap brave squaws. Well, shortly after that, the little girl's brother came from the Bannock tribe, and Anne told him to take the little girl back to her people. Well, so she sent the little girl off. Well, the brother took her off and ran into Little Soldier. And guess what he did? He traded her for some horses. So here she is back with the Indians, back with Little Soldier, who is going to kill her. Well, Little Soldier's wife took pity on the little girl, and when they were sent out to collect firewood and stuff, she nudged her over next to the river, and when they got close to the river, she pushed her into the river and told her to get away. And so the little girl is barefoot, and she managed to get away by jumping from rock to rock and so forth. And she managed to get away, and she came back to Ogden, which probably wasn't that far away, and she came back to the Barker home where she'd been treated well. Well, Anne was out in the corn at the time, and the little girl came in to her through the corn and kind of scared her. And she says, who's there? And the little girl said, it's me, Rhoda. Oh, I is so tired. Mother said, you poor little thing. Her feet were cut and bleeding from jumping on the rocks, and she was tired from running. The next day, once again, the whole tribe shows up, and they're squaws are all jabbering and they're all in an uproar. And it says, Father tried to tell them how wrong it was to abuse the little girl, and he asked what they were going to do with her. The little soldier just ran his knife across his throat. It says, all at once, Father began talking in their language, and they got so still you could hear a pin drop. He yanked little soldier's gun stick from him and pointed from east and west, and then from the north to the south. He talked a long time, and when he was done, every Indian jumped on his horse, shook hands with Father, and little soldier said, "He no talk. Great Spirit talk through him. Great Spirit heap mad if we harm squaw." And they left. Well, the little girl, they eventually sent her back to her people with a trader, and she found out, and they found that she eventually married a white man, and it says she raised a splendid family. But anyway, that's stories of Jane Isobel's mother, Anne Bligh, and her family, the kind of people they were. They were pretty devout, pretty close to the Spirit, apparently. And so that's a little bit of background about Jane Isobel. They came into the valley, like I say, in 49 and into that mound fort. She married Henry Dennison Durfee March 26th, 1857. And that spring, the same year that they were married, he was called by Brigham Young to be one of the Pony Express riders. While he was off doing the Pony Express, she lived with her his Henry Dennison's stepmother, which would have been Cynthia Bowen, and her maiden name was Cynthia Harrington. And there's a cool story about that, but I won't go into that. They moved around. Says spring of 58, which is the next year after he was gone on the Pony Express, he volunteered to help rescue the people from Salmon River, from Fort Limhi. Then after they got back, they were sent south because of Johnston's army. Spring of 60, they moved to Providence in Cache Valley, where they bought a farm. That same year, Henry Dennison was called to go with ox teams to help the poor into the valley. He was gone all summer, returned home in November. Then they lived in Cache Valley for a time, and then eventually they moved to Beaver Dam. Any of you know where Beaver Dam is? It's on the way into Logan Valley, Cache Valley. From there, they moved to Connor Spring, and they were not in Connor Spring for very long. Said they didn't have schools or meetings in that place because there were only two families living there, and I'm assuming that the two families were Henry Dennison and Myron were the only two families.
The reason they didn't stay in Connor Springs very long, because as you pointed out, it was right on the edge of the Salt Lake, and the soil was not good, and the water was brackish. I don't imagine they could raise hardly anything, and so they were only in Connor Springs for a couple of years before they vacated that spot.
And that's when I assume that Myron had seen this country when he came out on that rescue, and so they came here to this valley to settle.
Just explain which rescue, just for the record.
Well, the Almo massacre that took place. I always thought that they were living on Connor Spring when that massacre took place, but apparently not. Apparently,
Where is Connor Spring, Ken?
Well, everybody know where Corinne, Utah is? You get off the freeway right there by Brigham City and go back to the west. Well, there's a highway that goes up through there to, well, you can eventually get to the Golden Spike Monument going up around there. The Thiokol, plant was up in there. And Howell. Anyway, if you go between Corinne and Thiokol area, that stretch of highway, if you look around as you go through there, you can see what kind of land it is. There's lots of sinkholes and brackish ponds all over.
Greasewood.
And greasewood. Anyway, about midway between Corinne and Thiokol, there's a road that goes back up. There's a butte on one side and a bigger hill on the other. There's a kind of a valley that goes through there back towards Tremont. And if you go up through there about 4 or 5 miles on that road, you come on Connor Spring.
Thatcher's out there somewhere. Is Thatcher?
It's further.
closer to Tremont.
Yeah, it's a lot further north. This is, like I say, only 3 or 4 miles off that highway, so it's not very far back up in there.
Steph's showing on the map, it's not that far from Thatcher, but you can't get to Thatcher from there. Thatcher's kind of on the other side of the road.
Okay. So anyway, they ended up moving to Almo in, well, Henry Dennison came, well, back up. Myron came in 1878. Henry Dennison came in 79, but he only came long enough. He bought a piece of property in the cove, and he bought John E. Stein's cabin and the property that he had. Now, Johnny Steins, we call him Johnny Steins, he actually worked for a guy named Shirley. He was working for a cattle company. And we've all heard the story that the cove was a horse pasture for the Shirley Cattle Company. Well, John Steins was kind of taking care of the cattle and the horses in that area, and he actually was the first one to build a cabin there in the cove. I guess Jim Sage was in the area at the same time. So
Do you know where that cabin location is?
the cabin was located just about between my dad's house and Jim Sheridan's house, right on the creek.
Right on the creek there.
It's where the creek runs, goes under the road.
Right there.
Right at the bridge, right there. There's nothing left there to indicate there was anything there, but that's where it was. What else?
They left
Yeah, that's
Henry
right.
Dennison.
Bruce, going up in the tree.
You can come up. Henry Dennison came up and he bought that, but then he couldn't stay. His family was still down in Ogden, but he left his 2 sons, Henry Dennison Jr. and who was the other one?
George Leonard.
George Leonard. Left those 2 boys, and they were only teenagers as far as I understand, through the winter to take care of the
Take care of
cabin
the
and
place.
take care of things.
And then Henry Dennison didn't come back until the following spring and brought his family to live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the time they came back, there were about 9 families living here by that time.
Henry Dennison and his wife had quite a large family.
Yeah,
They
why
had
don't you
to-
go over those?
Well, I've got to get my notes so I can remember all their names.
You will recognize a lot of the names on this from Henry's family.
Yeah, they had quite a large family, and Henry Dennison Jr., Annie, known as Annie Cahoon, George Leonard, Lorenzo, my grandfather, Marion, William Wallace, Alice Jane, James Madison, Stephen, Sarah, Ellen, and Ida. It's interesting. My grandfather died in 1935.
Yeah.
1935.
Yeah, that's
And so we never knew our grandfather
right. No.
at all, but we knew our grandmother, Durfee, Bruges.
And which one was your grandfather then?
Lorenzo
Lorenzo Durfee.
And he was the fourth child of Henry Dennison Sr.
And he was married to?
Bruges.
Anna Abbey Bruges.
Okay.
That's an interesting thing because us and the Bruches are double related. Because Anna Abbey Bruges married Lorenzo Durfee, and Ida Durfee married Jake
John
Bruges.
Jacob Bruges.
And so,
Brothers married,
huh?
brother and sister married.
Brother and sister.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And tell Sherry's family.
Yeah. Now you also need to
And
get
Ev.
Aunt Ev. We always call her Aunt Ev, and that's because Aunt Ev married William Wallace Durfee.
And Ev Johnston.
That's right. Aunt Ev Johnston married William Wallace
When I heard
Durfee.
that, I thought that's gotta be the same.
But that's a really tragic story because she was a bride,
A mother.
A mother.
and a widow in 1 year, all in the same year.
Yeah.
So that
Sad.
didn't last very long. And Aunt Ev married Sheridan. And I'm not sure what his name was, but he married Sheridan. And
And they were given that 80 acres
Yeah,
that is
that-
your home now.
that was half
That
of
was
the,
part of the original Durfee Ranch, but it became the Sheridan.
Yeah,
Came there.
Henry Dennison turned that over to Aunt Ev
I think he
for
has
their
got
family.
lined up someday to tell you that story.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
good.
Anyway, that's how we're kind of connected there.
Anyway, getting further down the line, I don't remember a lot of these people, but I do remember some of them.
Can I interrupt just a second before
Sure.
you leave them? So all these places that you're talking about where the Durfees went, that's where the Johnstons were too.
That's right.
They may have all known each other
They-
and came out
yeah,
there
I'm sure.
around
They
the
did.
same
Okay,
time.
and the Johnsons are connected. What happened was that Frederick, okay,
Frederick Barker.
this picture is of Anne Bligh.
Yeah.
Anne Bligh was married to Frederick. And Frederick, well, we're in Ogden. Do you want to tell her the story?
Frederick Barker was married to Anne Bligh. Okay? They came across the plains. They had a family. They got to Utah, and while they were in Utah, all of these families were coming in. Frederick had a dream one night, and he saw a young mother and her family in this dream. The next day at church, the family came into church. And he took that as the sign that he was to take care of that family. So he went to Anne and told her how he felt, and she said, "That's fine. That's wonderful. You should marry her, but you'll still only have one wife." And so,
That part out, but that's what happened.
anyway, she divorced him and left him, and he married this other woman.
So no polygamy involved.
No, it wasn't polygamy.
And she
Married.
married
She ended up marrying George.
his brother.
His brother
George.
Really close friend. She helped take care of children.
So anyway,
As the stomach turns.
Bruce, the fact checker isn't going along.
You're not?
It's
Well-
pretty sketchy.
It's like Steve Durfee said the other day, we got all these cousins. But anyway, her boys were the Edward Johnston and Peter Johnston.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so they
that's
were-
how the Johnstons kind of came in, is through the Barkers and through George. So anyway, that's a kind of an interesting side note as well.
So anyway, I was getting ready to tell you, I know some of these people. I remember Aunt Ida, and I remember I don't really remember Annie,
No,
but I do remember Aunt Alice Rice,
Alice and Alice.
and I
Did she
remember
talk in tongues too?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah,
she
there
did.
were several of the family.
several of
that
the
did.
family could and did frequently talk in tongues. In fact, Aunt Alice would frequently do it, and it was embarrassing to her. She hated to do it, and I remember one time in fast and testimony meeting, she got up and bore a testimony, and nobody could understand a thing she said, and I think it was Uncle Herm or his wife got up and interpreted what she had said.
Herman Sarah.
Sarah,
Yeah.
which
And
was
Sarah
also one of
Sarah
the.
was a sister.
Sarah was a sister.
Also a sister.
And
She
I-
was one of Henry Dennison's
So-
kids.
And I don't remember her real well, but anyway, but
That's
I
how
do
we were
remember.
kind of all connected. I always remember calling Uncle Herm, which was Randy Taylor's grandpa,
We always called him Uncle
Uncle
Herm.
Herm.
Well, he kind of was.
So who
But-
interpreted, uncle or sister?
What's that?
Who's her?
Uncle Herm was a tailor.
He was Taylor.
Who
And
interpreted
Zen Taylor, Art Taylor, they were all kids of Herm Taylor.
I'm taking notes. Who
My memory is foggy enough that I don't remember which one of them. It was either Uncle Herm or it was his wife that got up and
Yeah.
tried to tell us what the Aunt Alice had said.
And it
I can't
may
remember
easily
that.
have been his wife because she would have been
The sister.
Ann Blythe's.
Yeah, yes. But I just, it's too far back. It's fog, you know.
Apparently, Jane Isobel spoke in tongues frequently
As
as
well.
well, and she was embarrassed by it
Yeah.
and didn't like to do it because it made her embarrassed and self-conscious. And she did it one time when Eliza Snow happened to be here. And Eliza Snow got up after she had spoken and told her she spoke in the Hebrew language and interpreted what she had
What she had
said.
said.
Because there's something about if this is coming from here, there should be somebody there
That's
that
right.
can interpret.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
That's correct. So anyway,
Anyway,
so that's probably enough on those kinds of experiences. One thing that I'd like to mention is that we have an orchard there where Dad lived.
the old orchard.
In the old
Everybody knows where
orchard
it is.
there. And there's some really nice apples. We've enjoyed those apples for years and years. And the trees are getting really old and starting to die out now. But Henry Dennison Durfee planted that orchard. And
4 generations.
when he planted it, I don't know who it was that talked to him, and he said, "Den, you'll never eat an apple off of those trees. What are you planting an orchard for?" And he said, "No, I won't, but my grandkids will." And we have.
And not only his grandkids, but his great-grandkids and great-greats.
So, anyway,
I
Anyway.
remember those hanging over the road, those apples, and Lotus driving the bus.
The trees are, they're getting so old now that they really struggle year to year, but some of them are still going.
yep.
Old trees are still
All right.
going.
Can't be.
Oh, Jen wants us to tell the story about Henry Dennison's eye.
Oh,
I don't know if you can see how his eyes are not exactly the same. Well, the story is, and now this picture over here on the side, we think might, I don't know for sure that it's a picture of that, but it's a picture of a reenactment of the massacre, of the Almo massacre. And they did a reenactment, and I don't know if they did it every year, but they did it this one particular year, and we have a history of it, documented history. And Henry Dennison and Myron Bushnell were some of the Indians.
No, Henry Dennison
Well,
was a white man, and
Right,
Myron
and
was
Myron was
wasn't it?
something
The
to.
other way around.
Or other way around. Anyway, fact checker. That's your job, buddy. You fouled it up.
I'll have to get back to it.
Okay.
Myron was a settler.
Okay, anyway, one of them was an Indian and one of them was the settler.
The brothers.
Yeah,
Brothers.
they were brothers.
And they
Brothers.
were a year apart. so
They were a
he
year
was
apart, and
right
they were
here.
probably having a good time with each other. Well, they had their guns loaded with blanks. Well, in the melee that ensued with enacting the massacre, Myron's gun went off and shot Henry Dennison in the eye
With the wad.
with
No
the
bullet.
wad.
Just,
Well, it damaged his eye.
The right eye? The right eye?
I guess it never says, but it hurt one eye, and so you can see he's always had an eye that looks a little different. Anyway, that's just a kind of a fun story. But it also tends to refute the idea that the massacre was made up in 1930 by people that were trying to just make the city of Rocks and Almo a spot on the map. Because it was, all of this took place before 1900 in the 1880s and 90s.
What is the story of the massacre? I don't know.
The story of the massacre
Yeah, sorry.
is that in 1862, somewhere in that neighborhood, it was one of the last wagon trains through that year. There were a lot of Indian problems. Government was on the verge of closing the road down because there had been so many Indian problems.
And it's the California Trail.
And it was on the California Trail, and these people were headed to California. They'd come across the plains. The story is that they had kind of harassed the Indians as they came along, and possibly even had shot and killed one of Chief Pocatello's sons as they came across. Well, the Indians were fed up with all this traffic going through their country anyway, and so Chief Pocatello got together a group of Indians, and it wasn't just his tribe, it was a lot of different ones that got together, and they determined they were going to clean up on this wagon train. And so they gathered in what's called Indian Grove. That's why it's called Indian Grove. And they gathered there and waited for the wagon train to come, and they pulled into the valley, spent the night on Almo Creek. When they were finished the next morning, they loaded up and all headed up for the Rocks. Well, my assumption is that they did not fill their barrels with water because they knew they were going to be going up a grade and that there was water in the city of Rocks, and so there was no need to fill the wagons
And that's documented by
and
Lind.
to haul the wagons up the hill with those water barrels full, and so they were empty. Well, once they got away from the creek, the Indians attacked, surrounded them, and laid siege to them, and over the course of several days, they had no water. And so they tried to dig a well and were unsuccessful. Eventually, 5 people managed to escape. Three guys.
No, 2.
Anyway, there was a.
Yeah, the guide and the girl.
There's a woman that managed to crawl out with her baby, and she carried the baby in her teeth.
blanket
Clothing.
with the teeth, yeah.
Had the blanket and crawled through the rose brush and stuff and got away. The baby, according to legend or whatever, died and is supposedly buried out by Cedar Creek out, and Stan Lloyd took us and showed us where that place was, according to what he believed. Anyway, there was only those few people that survived and got away. The rest of them were killed by the Indians. Some of those 5 people got to the Brigham City area and put together a group of men to come out and rescue the survivors. Well,
And
Myron Bushnell was one of the men that came on the rescue.
right,
Henry Dennison did not. It was just Myron.
that's how they found the valley,
Yeah.
supposed to.
And we believe that that is how the Durfees actually ended up here, was because of that massacre.
That's how they found the valley then.
Yeah,
Cut out to that.
right.
Come out to gather iron from the wag.
And that's another thing we have documented, is that this valley was the main source of iron for Utah, northern Utah, to make wagons and so forth, because they came out here and gathered up the wagon irons that burned out wagons.
From
And
the California Trail.
from the California Trail. And we've discovered, as Jan and I have researched this, we found that the Almo massacre wasn't the only one that happened here in the valley. There were probably 5 or 6, or maybe more than that. So there were a lot of burned out wagons. Most of the other ones that wasn't a complete massacre, it just people were robbed and their stuff was taken, and so then they'd go back and
Wow.
try to resupply and so forth, or join up with other wagon trains. The thing that's kind of unusual about it is that it was supposed to be close to 300 people that were killed. And because there is no real record in any military or anything, or newspapers, Brigham Madsen determined that it never happened, that it was all a fable. But we've got everybody in this valley, every family in this valley has stories
History of it, yeah.
that go along with the massacre.
Yeah, we're not really sure how many people it was. My dad felt like that it had happened all right, but he wasn't. He said, I don't know if there's 300 or not. It might have been just a few.
They think though that it was the last wagon train of the year, and
They
it was
gathered
about-
up stragglers.
and they were gathering up stragglers.
But it could have been a fairly large group, and it could have been a small group. It really doesn't.
Anyway, we could go into that another time. There's all kinds
Thank
of
you for sharing.
other information about it that's interesting, but that's what massacre
Okay,
is.
thank you.
So, speaking of Myron Bushnell Durfee, his brother, Clark, Pat checked me on this.
Good.
So he was one of the first, or the first man to come out here.
As far as I
Well,
other than
No.
a settler that
Settler.
actually homesteaded and homesteaded ground.
So,
Jim Sage was here.
yeah, but you're saying that Henry Dennison left 2 of his boys here. So did Myron.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Our
Yes, the
great-grandpa.
first year. Yeah, that's how
And
they
they
did.
were like, the 2 boys, and they were like 10. or
Yeah, well, they
11 or
weren't
something.
They weren't very old.
Yeah.
They took on responsibility really young.
And
And
see, that's partly why we ascertained that possibly Henry Dennison and Myron
And
drove
probably the
teams
other one.
across the plains for
Probably
other
the other one.
families. Was because time they were in winter quarters and stuff, they were in their teens.
Yeah.
And so I don't think they waited for their dad. I think they were pressed into service to drive others.
Well, and our Grandma Durfee Bruce drove a wagon from New Mexico
Yeah.
to Almo at the age of 13.
Yeah.
I mean, she did. She brought a
She
wagon. She drove it from New Mexico here. So, you know, a boy of 15, 16, 17 years old, he's going to be able to do
Perfectly
that.
capable.
Perfectly
Anyway.
capable of doing that kind of stuff.
What's interesting is that Myron, when he left his kids here, all was left was here was, you know, they said Jim Sage was the one that, but when Henry's boys were here, Myron would have been here to have looked after.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was a lot different situation.
Right.
And there were more coming because by the time Henry got here in 1880, says there were 9 families living here. So there were probably some Wards and I don't know who all, Bronsons and King,
Yeah, the Kings were there.
Eameses probably. I'm not sure when they came, but
Yeah, the Kings came first.
But anyway, there were a bunch of families, and most of those families came from the North Ogden and the Willard area that came here. It's interesting, the Oakley area was mostly settled by people from Grantsville, Tooele area. You look like you got a question.
No, I just think that's true. I remember hearing that.
Anyway, go ahead.
When I had to do a paper when I was in college, it was a history class, and he wouldn't let us do it on family history, but I said, well, Thomas Owen King was in the Point Express, can I do it on that? And when I was reading a lot of news articles and whatnot that I could find, originally Almo, the idea of the name of the town was Durfeeville.
Yeah.
So obviously the Durfees were here. That was one name that they thought about calling it, and then didn't say why they changed. And I'm not even sure where the name Almo came from.
according to Etta Taylor, it was kind of the Almo
Yeah.
because of this massacre
Because of the
thing.
massacre.
Yeah, and that's possible too.
They, in respect
There's one
to
other-
the Alamo, they shortened it, just said Alamo.
There's one other thing I want to point out to you guys that makes Almo different than probably any other community in Idaho, at least. All of these people came. They all came similar times, but they all would have had different water rights. And these people got together and they put their water rights together and formed the Almo Water Company. And they did that so that every family had water. Now you go to Albion, and the Dewey Ranch, which is on the very far end of the valley, was the first that was settled, and they claimed all of the water. And so all of the families that settled in Albion had to watch that water run through their place down to the Dewey Ranch, where it formed a great big lake because they didn't have enough ground to use it all,
Marsh
and the
Lake.
water went to waste.
So they called it Marsh Basin.
That's partly why they called it Marsh
That's
Basin.
right.
So anyway, that's one feather in the cap, I think, of this community. It was that the people were willing to work together to take care of one another, and they made this community a thriving community. So
The thing we want you to go away with is the fact that these people, while they endured tremendous hardship, they had faith. Life was not easy. Life was hard. But they kind of worked together and they had faith, and they made things work. And we're more closely connected with our ancestors than you think. Can I tell you one quick story? Personal thing. Most of you know my son Stephen. He's my youngest son. When he was born, Kay and I hadn't even talked about a name. We hadn't even talked about a name. He was the seventh one. We didn't have, another kid. We'll come up with something. We'll come up with something. And anyway, I was headed to the hospital, and I got thinking, I got to take Kay out of the hospital. We got to name that kid. What are we going to name that kid? And the thought struck me that his name should be Stephen. And I got to the hospital and I said to Kay, what are we going to name this kid? She says, well, I thought about Stephen. I said, dang. That's just what I was thinking about. But, and Henry Dennison, thank you, a little brain fog. Henry Dennison lost a son by the name of Stephen.
just an infant.
And in infancy. And I didn't realize this until I was just doing this studying, but I wonder if we're more closely connected to our ancestors than you think. Because, for Kay, and there's a lot of names out there, but for Kay and I to come up, and I hadn't even thought of a name, and neither had she, but to come up with that name like that, just a little weird to me. But anyway.
If you really listen to her, she talk in tongues.
Well, I do talk in tongues quite frequently. My wife says I talk in tongues in my sleep. She's always going, you said something, but I couldn't tell what it said. There you go.
Once again, some of you weren't here when I showed this picture. This is a picture that one of my cousin's boys drew. He's an artist, and he drew this, and this is a picture of him, the boy that went on a mission, and his great-grandfather, would it be, or grandfather? It'd be great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather.
Who is Lorenzo Durfee.
My grandfather.
So that would be my great-grandfather.
My grandfather.
Or my grandfather.
My grandfather.
Yeah, our grandfather. No, he's mine. Anyway, I thought that's really a cool picture. It looks like a photograph, but it's a drawing.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Anyway, you're welcome to look at that. I guess we're done.
Thanks, guys.